Okay, hello everyone. Thanks so much for coming tonight. So you probably know this is the last Inside Out of the year. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Zaina. I'm a second year, actually not anymore. I'm just a recently graduated student of the MA Interior Design from the School of Architecture of the Royal College of Art. So for those who don't know, again, we've been running this series all year long. It's called Inside Out. And I'm just so happy for everyone to be here tonight because we're trying the first hybrid. So it's between digital and physical. So we have people here at the pavilion and people on YouTube. And I'm going to co-host this tonight with Greg. So Greg, I'll let you present the panel.
Thank you, Zina. Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Grigoris, and I'm also a recent graduate of the MA Interior Design program of the School of Architecture of the Royal College of Art. As Zina already said, tonight is a very special event, and that comes, of course, with very special guests. So let me introduce you first to our speakers. First and foremost, we have the honor to have with us tonight the architect of the 2021 Serpentine Pavilion and director of Counterspace Studio, Sumayya Vally. Along with her is the assistant curator of the Serpentine Galleries, Natalia Grabowska. And our audience consists of students of the School of Architecture, along with our dean, Dr. Adrienne Lahoud, and our head of the MA Interior Design program, Professor Graham Brooker. I would like also to welcome everyone that is watching us from home through the RCA YouTube channel. And so, Zaina, could we start?
Go. First question?
Yes.
Okay. So, again, thank you so much for being here, Sumayya and Natalia. My first question goes to you both. This pavilion is a collaboration between Natalia, who's the curator of the Serpentine Galleries, and Sumayya, who's the architect. So, the first question is actually just to understand how you collaborated on the pavilion. At what point did you get involved in the design, Natalia? Could you just explain some more about this, please?
Hi, thank you so much for having me or having us. It's a real pleasure. Maybe I'll start just kind of saying a few words generally about how this commission functions. So, I mean, I'm sure you all know and are very much familiar being our neighbors, but just so you have all the background information. It is a commission that was established in 2000. It was conceived by Zaha Hadid together with our former director, Julia Payton-Jones. Together they were looking for a way to engage with architecture that goes beyond exhibiting models and sketches, and really to let people experience architecture in a way that it should be. And by that I mean that it is built and then you can welcome people to sort of walk through it, live it and hang around in it. And since 2000, we have every year commissioned architects that haven't built in the UK before. This is still our only requirement, that this is the first building that they built in England. And it's a very fast commission, so usually actually my work starts the minute that we open the pavilion. And by that I mean that I do a sort of long list of architects, see what has been happening over the past few years, look at different practices and who we want to invite. And the last, 2 years ago, we went for a similar process as every year. We have actually been following Counterspace's practice for quite a few years. We were always really interested in it. And we've decided to invite Sumayya together with a few other practices. It's always, the commission is by invitation only. We invite a few practices to submit a proposal, and then based on that proposal, we then commission the architect to design the pavilion. So my work with Sumayya started before she was even aware of it, I would say. And then from when we received the proposal, we were all really struck by how Sumayya pushed really the boundaries of this commission. And initially, she really wanted to dismantle this pavilion completely over time, or almost completely over time, and displace it into various locations in London. And for a lot of reasons, the constraints of these commissions are such that we couldn't quite do that, but we really wanted to embrace this concept. And I guess when we, from the moment that you've learned that you will be designing this pavilion, this is where our sort of true collaboration started. And by that, I mean, I guess I know I've been at the Serpentine for almost 4 years now, so I know the institution and the commission quite well by now, and I could guide Sumayya through the process. But also, when it became very clear that we will be doing fragments of the pavilion, we will be displacing parts of the pavilion into other neighborhoods in London, I guess we worked together on establishing relationships with different partner institutions, and also just using the Serpentine network and our experience and knowledge, collective knowledge, with, in establishing these, we had some of these relationships existing already. So that was a first step of, reaching out to people that we knew, and also just the way of navigating the city. I guess you all not only collaborated with me, but also with a wider Serpentine team, with other curators in both civic and education team, with whom you still work quite closely on this commission. And then I guess, my sort of role as a curator was then Sumayya was very generous and still is with sharing her ideas with me and really bouncing her ideas with me, which I found really, very sort of welcoming and as I said, very generous. And it's the way of work that I love and I really believe in that kind of act of sharing. I always really believe in working across our generation and how we can support and what we can learn from one another. When Sumayya says I was involved in the design process, I'm not sure that's quite true, because the design is all hers, but I like to think of a person just holding Sumayya's hand along this process.
I think Natalia explained that really beautifully, but just to maybe add a little bit, it hasn't so much been just a design process about a built piece, but very much about a series of activations and a series of events that really, I feel like after we've had this big push towards this moment happening, that our work is really starting now. And even before the panel started, Natalia was asking me how it went looking for this meeting and this thing. And so, I mean, I think that our work's really just only beginning. And I really genuinely do feel that that's been very much a part of the design process, because the pavilion is not just about this built output. It's about the conversations around it. It's about the programming that we're working towards. It's about the publishing that works alongside it, and that will continue on after its physical lifespan. And so she has genuinely been very much a part of the design process. But also, I think just, I am an architect and I'm a young architect also, and Natalia has a lot of curatorial experience working in the institution. And she really has embraced my, I don't want to call it naivety, but in a way it is a naivety towards what is possible. Sometimes when I'm pushing something, or it might be seen as pushing a boundary, it's just an idea that I have. And Natalia treated every single idea with utmost seriousness also, which has been a real blessing. The other day Hans Ulrich said that I'm one of the few people he's met who's pushed the limited edition, and I said it's because I never knew what a limited edition was. But in these conversations with Natalia, she kind of does take everything really seriously, which has enabled so much of this project and what it is.
Thank you so much. It was really interesting to learn and to have an overview of your collaboration, because you talk about the human context of how this pavilion is built. And now I'd like to go to the design context of the pavilion, because I think it very much relates to the name of our series, which is Inside Out, because this pavilion is at the same time inside and outside. and it has to be an interior, it has to be an architectural piece, it has to relate to the Serpentine Gallery, to the urban fabric of London and Hyde Park. So maybe in a few sentences, because I'm sure it's a very long process, could you tell us how you tackled these different scales and how you came about to build that pavilion that can relate to this very wide context and the smaller context of it?
Yeah, I think I really love the name of your series also. And I think it's also at the heart of what this pavilion is trying to do. It's very much about operating at different scales. And I think also, just even conceptually, I've always been interested in interiors and in how so many of the spaces that we looked at, some of the first venues to play black music, some of the first publishing houses in London for black literature, some of the first mosques and African churches and synagogues and so on. They happened in small interior spaces that functioned as extensions of public spaces. And then also so many exterior spaces that we looked at, like porch steps that we used for organizing before the times of protest and so on, how those came to function as almost domestic spaces, and how people look after each other's children in storefronts, and how that inversion has always been something of interest to the project in general, conceptually. But physically, this idea of inside out is really important because it is so much about, of course, folding London into the pavilion and bringing all these voices into Kensington Gardens. But then, as we mentioned in our introduction, it is conceived in 5 parts. And it's also about folding the pavilion out into London and seeding these collaborations with our partner institutions across the city.
So I'd like to ask something about the nature of the pavilion as a public space, which is actually a public space for gathering. We could say an inclusion place for that aims to activate dialogue between the built environment and humans, the users. So how do we as designers create this interface without forcing people's behavior in space, without doing big gentrified approaches?
I have no idea. I think, well, I don't know. I think essentially that there are, even to say essentially sounds wrong, but I feel like there are 2 innate ways of being. One is very much about projecting, and I think architecture also is always an act of projection. But there's one that is very much about arriving, about rationalizing, and about imposing. And there's another way of being that I think is innate to all of us. If we think about times before Enlightenment and that era, that is very much about listening, about absorbing place, and about being able to reflect. And so I don't know, but I think that there's something about listening as a practice and as a methodology that's really important, and that I think is important for me to embrace in my practice. This idea of finding ways to create dialogue, not just in terms of thinking about the end product and how it will facilitate dialogue, but also how dialogue can be a method for practice. That we find different ways of listening to silences and whispers, that we find ways of listening to things in the archives, things that have fallen out of archives, formal archives, and also listening to the ground, listening to the earth, listening to other voices, and then using our agency as spatial practitioners and architects to facilitate dialogue by eventually projecting something. And I think one doesn't know. For me, it's been an immense honor and really incredible to receive some of the feedback that we've received, and to have some of our community partners walk into the space on our preview day and think about how they'd like to use it and suggest those ways without us prompting or preempting that at all, which has been really incredible. So I think somehow, I'm not saying that this is what I'm doing and what is happening, but I do believe that if we are able to listen deeply first, that resonance will translate somehow. and it will be felt, and hopefully that will create dialogue. That feels very esoteric, but you're asking something also that we all struggle with every day.
Exactly, that's why I asked. I think. No, but I mean, yes, as you say, it's also in the hand of the user to listen and feel the space. So you're mentioning like how important it is to listen, and you actually came here very early to listen, London. You came for a short period of time to live here, and you explored like different spaces, a variety of spaces of different cultural production. And I would like to ask, how important is this lived experience of a space as a tool for architectural research?
I think it's been incredibly important for me. I don't know how we would have realized or manifest the project otherwise, but I also think that forms of listening extend to many. There are many tools for that, and lived experience is one, and has been incredibly important for me. Working with the archives has been another really important tool that we've worked with. But I think that there are many other ways of listening also that we need to learn and explore and find. And I'm saying that because I think that so much of what we need to hear, we're trained to be deaf to. And so, I think lived experience is one, but I think that there's something that we need to be able to learn in our lived experience and in our ways of drawing and making that is able to properly listen or to also learn how to be in dialogue.
Can I also add one thing, which is that I think both Sumayya and I, we were very conscious because we were just sort of this team of two. Sumayya was working alone in her practice, and I at the Serpentine was also leading sort of single-handedly on this commission. We were both very aware that we are not from London, that my experience is only from the past sort of 10 years. Sumayya's experience was only from, the time that she was doing the research, and we were looking at a lot of both archival but also existing places, so both present and past places. And we were very conscious that this is not our history, this is not our stories to tell. So we really were also trying to listen and really amplify the voices of people who have lived those experiences, of people who have been part of these places and have established these places. And by that I mean that for even for the catalog that we are publishing, we really wanted to work with people who know London and who knew these places and who have already a resonance to these places. Same with partner institutions, same with sort of the live program that we're doing with the partner institutions. It's all about those histories. And of course, the more we were digging deeper, the more connections actually resurfaced. So we're working with one place, which is the Tabernacle in Notting Hill. The director, Matthew Phillip, from one word to another, when he was showing us the Tabernacle, we noticed that there are a lot of memorabilia from Mangrove, and he sort of very easily dismissed it. He was like, oh, sorry, it's all the Mangrove stuff because Frank Critchlow was my father. And we both literally stood and were like, what? We were looking at, we were researching the history of Mangrove, and it's one of these amazing. And he was like, oh, yeah, I can tell you all about it. And you should have some of it. And, so it was really important for us to, and Matthew is just one of these many connections and stories and relationships that we've established. And I think we also had, this huge respect and huge consciousness that while we have both of our sort of stories of, I always also say that even though we come from very different geographies, I come from Warsaw, from Poland, and Sumayya is from Johannesburg. We come from these cities that have a history in the 20th century of separation, but also, of division, but also of beautiful movements of resistance. And I think we kind of wanted to translate or sort of look for these contexts and look for places like that in London, and really wanted to connect with people who have been part of establishing these places. So I guess this is also what you mean when you say, like, you know, deeply listening. It was that kind of approach that we took.
Just a great transition for the second part of this interview, because you talk about listening and opening conversations and collaborating. And tonight, I know that Sumayya was really keen to listen to what students had to say and have questions from them. So we're not quite there yet. Before we go to the students, we have to respect our dean and the head of program who are here as well. And I want to start with Dr. Adrian Lahoud, the dean of the School of Architecture of the Royal College of Art, and see if you have a question for our great guests tonight.
Sure. Thank you, Zaina. We've had a discussion, and sitting here, actually, I was reflecting on the discussion that we had already, and it's actually it's really quite extraordinary having a chance to see the project in this light as well at this time of day, and it's continually shifting, you know. And it does something very, very particular formally and spatially. And I'm trying to kind of disappoint Zaina, because Zaina wants me to ask a kind of Global South question, so I'm just going to try to kind of ask a design question instead, just to annoy her. There's something around the materiality of it, which I find just absolutely incredible. On one hand, it feels like a memory of something, because it both like refers to something solid, but is kind of insubstantial. And I wonder if you could say a few words just about your strategy around the color and the materiality and the surface of the pavilion, because it's actually quite striking how it is also continually changing, and also picking up different kinds of light qualities, because we have a chance to see it now quite often. So.
Thanks so much. It's so beautiful to hear you say that. Thank you. I also get asked about the materiality a lot. But it's the colors were inspired by photos of London from the archive, and also some of my iPhone photos of being here. And in particular, the light quality in London, especially on a day like this, when it's quite soft and bleached and subtle. It's a kind of washed lighting that's very different from the lighting in Johannesburg. And I found that quite striking and quite beautiful, and something that I wanted to bring to the pavilion. But also I think there are 8 colors here, but it's meant to feel like a soft gradient of grays. So there's gray, brown gray, pink gray, green gray, blue gray, and gray. And it's also very much about a coming together of different places, and that's articulated in the way these geometries fit and puzzle together. And it is almost like a reverse ruin, I think, which is a little bit what I'm hearing you describe. It's about these transfers of many different places coming together and then fitting together to form the structure. Yeah. But it's also, the transfers are not literal, as I'm sure we've talked about as well. They've been abstracted. So I worked a lot with mapping out these architectural gestures of generosity in the many places that we looked at and worked with, and then abstracted them and thought about how surfaces hold bodies and how conversations were engendered, you know, one-to-one intimate conversations or larger group gatherings and so on. And each of these functions as a small gathering moment, but they also all, as you can see here, face each other. So there's, I hope, a kind of generosity in that it can be something for a small intimate gathering or conversation, but then it also functions as a larger gathering structure.
Yeah, I guess that's what I found so interesting about it, is because, of course, it is like partially image and partially architecture at the same time. It's kind of in the in-between space, and it makes me think that it's actually kind of it's a mediating project in many ways, not just between, you know, the idea of a kind of permanent or temporary building, but in terms of this site in relationship to London, in relationship to those kinds of communities. And I wonder, in that kind of mediation, when those communities come back, what is their sense of the kind of materiality of the colors, of the form, of the arrangements? What kinds of experiences does it elicit in them when they've come back here to have a look at it?
Well, I think it's. No one is. Maybe I don't know if anyone would tell me if they hate it. Before the pavilion opened, I spent a lot of time at the fence, and I think I heard a lot more honest opinions then than I did afterwards. Because now I guess many people who come here know that I'm the architect, so I don't know that I'm getting honest feedback. But yeah, I think I found it really interesting listening to what people thought before it opened as well. And, you know, yeah, I don't know what else to say beyond that. It was really interesting to hear the diversity of opinions about what a pavilion for London should be and should look like, and whether it should feel monumental or light. And so I think, on the one hand, there are all of those considerations which are very much about taste, and many people come in and say that they really enjoy it, they love the color, they love the experience of being in the space, that it feels almost temple-like, or that it coheres really differently in experience compared with what it does in the image that they've seen on Instagram, which I find deeply satisfying. But I think that just being able to see how people are using the structure, and to see, you know, children climbing onto things and people holding workshops in the space. For me, that is the deepest honor, that it is actually being used as a gathering space for many gatherings.
I'm going to hand over to Graham in one sec, but one last question, which is, you know, this is probably the first pavilion that very consciously tries to think about London in its broader sense and engage very precisely with a series of like community histories. Having started that process and imagining, you know, in a year's time, in 2 years' time, in 3 years' time, when this is gone as a physical structure, what is the legacy of that process?
So that, I think, and also I think, just thinking about the question that you just asked about the response from people, and from our partner institutions in particular, I think that we're already seeing that we have a number of collaborations, not just for the summer, and I don't know how much I'm able to talk about beyond the summer. But for example, with one of our partners, as I said, when they walked in, they asked if they could use the space for their press launch day, and which is fantastic and a huge honor for us. But there's also been a set of commissions for us to be able to work in their space and on their program for next year, completely independent of the Serpentine and of this pavilion project as well, on like a year-long research and design build project in their space. So I think that's a testament also to how Natalia's worked to set up the collaborations, and that they are, for me, they do feel deeply honest and rigorous in that regard. That, you know, it's not. We also, I think, in thinking about how COVID has affected the project, we very much thought that because of the way the commission runs, that it would be the pavilion and alongside it these fragments, and that it would be a research process that ended with the launch of the pavilion. But it's become, in a way, the opposite. It's become a project that started with the opening of the pavilion, and the work on the fragments is just starting, but it's also opening up a series of longer projects that are continuing. This one that I just mentioned has been completely, you know, spontaneous, not by our making at all, but there are other projects that the Serpentine is also going to be involved in longer term, like the radio station that we're setting up in Barking and Dagenham. The artist in residence for the summer is Joe Nami. We're very excited about that. And the support structures program, we're also at the moment in the process of working on selecting 10 artists and collectives to work with, up to 10, I should say, for this year. And that's another example of something that's continuing on beyond this.
Now on to Graham Brooker, head of the interior design program of the Royal College of Art.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Greg. Thanks, Zaina. Zaina's and Greg are going to want me to ask you a question about reuse, so I'm trying to swerve that one. I'm trying to think of something else. I I recognise a sensibility here in this pavilion, which I haven't seen in previous pavilions, which is one of the reasons I think it's my favourite pavilion ever. And that sort of sensibility, for me, is one about aggregates, fragments, and I've seen Counterspace's work on dust and so on and so forth. For me, it's a very interior sensibility, which is about kind of using stuff that's already around us, and which is one of the reasons why I love it so much. But I wanted to ask you about that sensibility, because for me, it comes from a particular place, which maybe we haven't seen here before. So tell me a little bit about that. Where does it come from?
Well, I think that being from Johannesburg, I have inherited, the one thing that I always say is the desire to read things that are happening beneath the surface. And the other, I think, is an attitude towards working with very little and working with reclaim as much as we can. But having said that, I also believe deeply in imagining anew and imagining entirely differently. And so, yeah, but I think it's impossible to be, or actually not, it's not impossible, but that we should never imagine that imagining anew is in a vacuum or in a bubble, but always understanding how entangled it is with everything around us, and how I think I see threads in all of my work and also across projects. If each project is a kind of, how do I say, a moment, and there are, one dot in a constellation. They also all speak to each other in terms of how connected everything is: empire, extraction, forces of labor, climate crisis, migrations, Commonwealth. Everything is related, and so there's also I think it's just a desire to read and to work with that also has an attitude towards reclaim and reconfiguration, and not necessarily rescripting, but scripting. Yeah.
Does that come from your education, or just as a human being, or both, or all of these things?
I don't know. I think I also often get asked about my identity, and as a Muslim, as a woman, etc., 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 what that does, or how it shapes my worldviews and my ways of practice. And I think that, of course, I'm sure it does, but I'm also sometimes hesitant to claim those things, because they mean many things. And in my makeup as a Muslim woman from South Africa of Indian heritage, and I think I could also go on a little bit more about that, on that line. I think it's important that we start to realize that is just a diversity of lenses in one person, and that someone next to me who has the same titles and labels will be able to create entirely differently, because it means something entirely different for them.
Thank you.
Thank you, Graham, and thank you, Adrian, for the questions. Now it's time to go on to the students. So we have Louisa here, who's going to take the mic around for the 6 students that have been selected to ask their questions today. And the first one is from Remy Kuforiji. Here.
Thank you. Do I have to wear my mask? Okay, cool. Well, again, thank you very much for hosting this. It's been a really amazing opportunity, and congrats to both of you for a really beautiful pavilion. But I can talk about what I love about it, but I'd like to just ask a couple questions about the context which it sits in. So I'm going to very quickly look at my phone. Prepared these. So I guess Sumayya, growing up in South Africa, and now being invited to operate within sort of the context of British imperial institutions, how does your practice speak to ways of being across the diaspora?
Thanks, Remy, for the question. I like your shoes.
I was going to say the same.
I think I answered it a little bit now, but very much so. I also think that I grew up in South Africa, but one should never imagine that South Africa is, I mean, of course, it is a completely different context and a completely different geography, but just also thinking about our systems of education and so on, they've all been inherited. And of course, that's why I often talk about reading beneath the surface, because all of us have been so trained not to see what is actually happening and what actually makes up our city and our land, and to remember our ways of being that are inherent to us. And so I think in many ways I approached working on the pavilion in the same ways that I would have approached any project in Johannesburg, which is also really rife with so many challenges around separation and colonization, and whose voices are heard and whose aren't, and so on. And I think that for me that is the work of my practice more broadly. So I think, yeah, there's something about an intent and a desire to work with things that are entangled and to understand complexities of relationships between everything. That is in this pavilion and is in all of my work in Johannesburg. But I also think that, as Natalia said, we're both very aware of our positions as outsiders in many ways in London. But I think that all of us are also, in any context, insiders and outsiders. And Adrian and I talked about this before as well. I think learning how to navigate and negotiate that also as a form of agency is really important. And in my own context, I also am still, in the profession, in many ways, I'm an outsider. I've always been an outlier. My way of practice never quite fitted into the architectural profession at home. When I was a student, many of my projects didn't neatly fit all of the briefs either. And there's agency in that, I think. And I think learning how to work with that and cast that in as many ways as we can is important, especially now.
Yeah, thank you very much. If it's all right, I have one more question. Cool.
Go, Remy.
Okay, I think you touched on this a bit earlier, but do you see your projects as almost singular moments in time or singular entities, or do you hope that they can provide almost a framework for new modes of resistance outside of yourself? Like, are you sort of creating that groundwork to allow for your sort of pedagogy, your sort of practice to sort of live on way past you? I guess it's a question of legacy that we asked earlier.
I hope so. I think yes and no. I think for me as a project, I'm interested in pushing new ways and modes of practice, and in understanding how different ways of being can create different ways of practicing and different forms of pedagogy also. And of course, I hope that has a long-term ambition, but I can also genuinely say that, it has a long-term ambition. I hope it has a long-term impact, and that we are able to generate different and diverse bodies of knowledge, as we're hoping to do with the Support Structures program and many of the collaborations with the fragments. But I think that also just the learning in working in those ways for me as an architect, and what that has done for my practice and how enriching it's been to the ways that I practice is really invaluable. So I can see so many thoughts and methods in my pedagogical work that we're working on here in terms of thinking about how things are choreographed or working with events and so on, which of course in a studio environment translate into very fantastical and abstract works. But being able to have the luxury of working on those questions really slowly in a teaching studio environment then filters down into testing it really boldly in a short-term project like this one. So I don't know if that's answering the question, but of course I hope that my work does have long-term impact, but if it doesn't, it really has enriched my own my own way of practice and the ways that I see being able to practice in different realms and in different speeds has been important for just carving what I define and imagine as architecture, even just for me.
Thank you. Next question from Lean Ajlan.
I just want to say, first of all, congratulations on the pavilion. And I feel like you've touched upon this already, but I was more so curious outside of this pavilion, how you, Sumayya, you would situate your spatial practice as a mode of activism, and kind of what was that born out of, and whether that was your education or your want or need to design for diaspora communities, or the process of basically how you began this.
I don't think that of course I think that I am. I hope I'm an activist, let's say that. But I don't think I ever situated my practice as activist explicitly. And in the beginning, Counterspace was born out of a frustration around what I was seeing happening in the profession and in the canon also. And so when we first started, it was a group of friends in our master's studio, much like all of you, also finishing right at the end. And I think all of us felt like we didn't want to let go of the amazing energy that we shared as friends and collaborators, and our deep love for Johannesburg and for learning how to read it and translate it and absorb it. And so I also felt very much at that time that the things that I saw in Joburg that excited me deeply, I wasn't really finding them anywhere in the profession or in my education. And so Counterspace was born in response to that. I think, of course, that is activist, but it didn't, I never bore that statement or said that anywhere. For me, it was really just a desire to be able to work on learning about the city and on translating those phenomena and imagining how they could push the discipline forward. Because I found that there were so many ways of being and ways that the city was already being made that we could learn from. And I'm not just talking about what we know as community practice, but I think thinking about things that are oral, embodied, choreographed, performed, things that happen in Johannesburg in the creative and visual arts scene, in the fashion scene, in the music scene, and in so many other creative disciplines are just really very progressive. And I had a desire to be able to translate that architecturally that I didn't feel was happening at the time.
Thank you so much. That's incredible to hear.
Thank you, Lean. The next question is from Sharon Shim, right here. Thank you, Louisa. No, the one just behind.
Hi, thank you so much for your time today. Congratulations on the pavilion. I just have some questions about the sensitivity of the space. And you mentioned in one of your interviews that architecture can be akin to performance and ritual, more expression than edifice. How do you want people to engage in this pavilion or the gallery space, and what and how do you want the visitors to feel and be involved in the place?
I don't know that I have a prescriptive idea of how people should feel, but I hope. So this pavilion, as I said, was very much about mapping and learning from architectural generosities, and I hope that when people use the space that they feel that. That's all. I hope in the architectural conversation that some of these spaces that we've worked with researching and so many of them and that we're still discovering through our longer process of engagement, I hope that bringing these to the architectural conversation sparks discourse and dialogue about these places, about embodied archives around these places, and about how we can learn from them and work to evolve them. But in terms of visitor experience, I just hope that people enjoy it.
Because I see many different forms and heights, so I was thinking also maybe there can be different type of actions going on, or
Well, I mean, I think that in terms of the logic of the space, there were lots of things that I thought about. So many of the spaces that we worked with and that we mapped out they facilitated performance in some way. We looked a lot at porch steps and how they became moments for people to meet and organize before the times of protest, or sound systems in Brixton. We looked at unfurled and unfolded surfaces on street sides that became places for people to eat and gather or to break fast. We looked at canopies in markets that become shade or table surfaces for people to work and talk across, and those have been abstracted in the pavilion. So I think that of course there are moments where I hope that there will be a performance. I saw on Instagram the other day that there was an interpretive dance the other day, which is wonderful. And I think those are the kind of interactions that we hoped for. We also are going to be working with programming some events that will do that. But in general, I think for me the learning was also so much as an architect. And I hope that people are able to feel and enjoy that. It's also a pavilion that doesn't have a front and a back, and all of the exterior edges can also be approached from the park and used and sat on. And we've seen also, children really enjoying that. And when the sound installation is on, people really trying to find a quiet place to sit and listen. So I hope that it will be used in many ways that we also didn't predict or imagine.
Okay. Thank you.
Next question is from Yaki Lee, over there.
Thank you so much for today's talk. So my question would be the site, because site is one of the key elements for a spatial project. And Hyde Park is a site that we as RCA students kind of familiar with. So how do you understand Hyde Park as the site of the project? I mean, you have mentioned about how did you work with London at the wider context. But what I'm trying to ask is about how do you understand this specific place, the plants, people, animals, and the existing architectural fabric here. Did they bring any inspiration or restrictions or challenges to this project? Thank you.
I think in terms of the brief, of course, there are many restrictions. It's a protected park, and so the distance that we have to keep from the trees and so on is very specific. In terms of the physical site and the architecture, of course, I did respond to framing, and I thought very much about the colors against these colors. I thought of the color of the flowers in bloom behind us, as well as thinking about light quality in London. And also, I wanted to be able to celebrate the park in working with how one experiences the trees and the landscape from the inside. But I also thought of it as a calm urban experience inside of the park.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, the next question is all over there. Sorry, Luisa. It's from Natalia Garcia, and then we'll have one left after that.
Hi. So going back a bit on the topic of the materials choices, I imagine you talked about this a lot. It's really striking, I think, the fact that we are seeing this cement surface all around, and I think it literally brings us to this aspect of heaviness. But the space in a counterpoint has this very light ambience. I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more, how did you choose this materiality as a medium for the message you wanted to bring, and why was this a good choice for you?
So I think it was mentioned earlier that there is an attitude towards reclaim in the pavilion, and so just on a basic materials level, most of the material in the pavilion is reclaimed. The cork on the outside is reclaimed from the wine industry, and we worked with sustainably sourced ply that's covered in micro cement, as you said, and the steel on the inside is from the contractor's steel yard from their previous projects. And I think thinking about the materiality, you have articulated very much what I wanted to achieve. I wanted it to be able to feel cast and like it's transferring many places, but also that there's an atmosphere and an ambience of lightness. And so I wanted it also to feel like it's a solid that's been carved, which is why all of the exterior elements that hug the outside are black, the black cork. And I don't know, I think in moments like that one, you can see a suggestion when you're standing outside that it feels like something that's been carved in, and that speaks to the process of working with excavating many of these places and is honest to the way that we had to model from photos and very scant plans some of these forms and then work with abstracting them. So in the beginning I worked a lot with collages, but I also worked with clay models and worked on carving forms. And I sound like a very basic architect now. But yeah, that's just on a physical material level, that's what I was hoping to work with and achieve.
Last student question from Vanda Hajizadeh.
So first of all, thank you very much for this talk. The thing I want to ask is about social and environmental sustainability in architecture. And actually, can you tell us more about how you see social sustainability in your works?
So I think that, of course, there's, on the one hand, the project of thinking about how social relationships function and how they can be maintained or sparked or supported and deepened, which is at the heart and at the center of this project for me. I'm mentioning it again, but thinking about the collaborations that we have beyond the life of the project and about the fellowship program that we're working on to support artists. And that project is for me about being able to seed and support different bodies of knowledge in the arts. And I think that that's, of course, a very direct way of thinking about social sustainability. But I think that the deeper project of social sustainability is also about being able to imagine differently from perspectives of difference. And often, in my own context, I think when we think or talk about social sustainability, there's an aesthetic that's attached to it, and it's very much spoken about in the context of service delivery and of answering urgent needs. And of course, I think that that's very important and not to be disregarded in any way, but I think that sometimes that focus is at the expense of thinking about the deep social project of imagining pedagogy, curricula, and the profession entirely differently. And so, if anything, I hope that this project also becomes, for me, the start of a trajectory that is working towards that.
Thank you.
Okay, so the last question will be mine. It's a question we love to ask this year. Maybe you heard it in the other Inside Outs. It's a question for all of us here today. Some of us recently graduated, and we look at you, and you look so young, and you probably are really young also. And you already built this Serpentine Pavilion, and many of us are gonna go out and start our journey as a designer. So what would be your advice for all of us today?
It's it's such a big question. I think when I work with my own students and my own colleagues, I'm always so moved by just what is inside everyone. And I know it's going to sound cheesy, but I think to not be afraid of youth also as a very important lens, and to be able to embrace it and work with it alongside all of the other lenses of our identities is really important. And I think being able to find and sharpen one's own voice and work on how that manifests as architecture or as practice or as, you know, either in practice or pedagogy or writing, whatever form that takes, to be able to work with youth as one of those lenses while you can is such a gift. And I just want to encourage everyone to be able to do that. I already feel very old and jaded and irrelevant. So enjoy it while you can.
You heard her. Enjoy while you can. So I'll let Greg end this event. I'll come back in a second.
I'd like to thank everyone in the physical audience and the digital audience watching us from home for being here tonight. Thank you, everyone, for your amazing questions and the wonderful discussions that were produced here. In specific, I'd like to thank Sumayya and Natalia. It was a pleasure having this discussion with you. Thank you, Adrian and Graham, for being here. Thanks, everyone watching from home. A big thanks also to the Serpentine Galleries and especially to Nadia and Jordan for making this event possible.
Okay, so now I have a lot of thank yous, so I'm really sorry in advance. You can rest for a minute. It may take 2 minutes, or it's going to be a bit shorter if I start crying. But today is the last Inside Out of the year. And first of all, I want to thank you so much for coming out tonight for the last event. It was such an honor to have you. You were so generous with us from the start. So thank you so much. Then I want to thank the viewers who followed us all year from our rooms in lockdown, each in our own city, in Greece, Italy, France, etc. And now, I don't know, I'm just so happy that we're all reunited in London tonight. Whew. I'll try not to cry. Very emotional, sorry. And then first person I want to thank again is Graham. So I'm not looking at you because you're going to be the trigger. But I just want to say that what I admire the most about you is that you give a voice to the students. And without you, none of this would have been possible. So thank you so much. And I want to thank the Dean of the School of Architecture, Adrian, for supporting us all year and for joining the events and for spreading this lecture series to the whole School of Architecture when it just started from the small, little, tiny program of interior design. And then last but not least, I really want to thank the Inside Out team. I think I was really lucky to be surrounded by really good friends while presenting this series all year long. So the first one of them is Greg. Thank you for co-hosting tonight, and thank you for just being you. Thank you, Luigi, who couldn't make it tonight. We miss you. Thank you, Donald. I think you can come up here if social distancing is okay. I might get killed, but if you stay 2 meters apart. So thank you to Donald, who was with me doing some Insta-outs every week. Maybe you saw him. Thank you to the first years, so Francesca, Teresia, Zhang Wang, and of course a giant thank you to our superhero Luisa, without who nothing would have been possible. Thank you so much. So I want to officially pass the torch and give this torch to Francesca Morris, the next leader of Inside Out, and take care of the series. Thank you so much. And I have no torch, so you killed the
I guess.
Okay.
We'll see you all next year. Tune in for what we have coming. Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.